Welcome to Berries in the Interim podcast, where we explore the cutting edge of innovative clinical trial design for the pharmaceutical and medical industries, and so much more. Let's dive in.
Welcome, everybody, back to In the Interim. I'm your host, Scott Berry, and I've got a wonderful topic today. And I was chatting with Steve just before we hit go here. We're episode 65 of In the Interim. And I think I've been doing clinical trials for 27 years. If I were to stop tomorrow and somebody said, Scott, what was your biggest accomplishment? It would be REMAP-CAP. REMAP-CAP to me will be, one of the incredible things in my life, the experience of it. It in of itself as a scientific beast, the impact it's had, the so many aspects of it, the friendships that have grown out of it. So it's the most impactful. And here we are, episode 65, and this is the first episode on the REMAP-CAP trial. Part of it is it's such a beast to get your arms around. So I'll introduce and we'll talk about this. This is going to be the origins of the REMAP-CAP trial. In and of itself is such a cool story of it. And my guest today was their creation of this, also a very good friend of mine, Steve Webb. Steve is a professor, is intensive care specialist and a professor of critical care research at Monash University. He's also the executive director of Empiric, which is a whole separate podcast. Interestingly, I do a lot of sports things, and in sports, they talk about a first ballot Hall of Famer. Steve, in 2014, the Australian government established the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, and he was part of the 14 fellows that initiated the academy. So very well-respected researcher. His clinical trials he's designed have enrolled more than 70,000 patients, $200 million in funding, more than 30 papers in the New England Journal and JAMA, more than 75,000 references, huge impact on patients. He's also one of the global leaders of the REMAP-CAP platform trial and was the head of the International Trial Steering Committee when COVID hit. And that'll be a big part of our story. So, Steve, welcome to In the Interim.
Thank you very much, Scott. It's a great pleasure to be chatting about the beast.
Yes, the beast. All right. So I was curious going back and remembering this, and I got in a bit of a rabbit hole with this and looking back at all the emails. I want to know, when was the first email? I have all my emails ever from Berry Consultants, which is fun things going back to. The first email that ever showed up was Steve Webb on it. So I look back, and this was March 13th, 2012, is the first email where you and I are both on the email, and it's from Derek Angus. It's a follow-up to a Pittsburgh meeting that is talking about potential pandemic. Sorry, I wasn't there, but the aftermath of this came about. Do you want to describe this meeting and the subsequent meetings and pandemics?
So the story of REMAP-CAP really starts in the Southern Hemisphere winter of 2009, when the swine flu pandemic spread around the world. Came to Australia, New Zealand, other parts of the Southern Hemisphere first. And it was a decent pandemic. In the Royal Perth Intensive Care Unit, where I was a specialist, at the peak of the pandemic, half of the intensive care unit was occupied by patients with swine flu, all of whom were ventilated, all of whom were very sick. But swine flu came and went over the space of 2 winters, one southern, one northern. And the world sort of took a breath and said, well, that was bad, but it could have been a lot worse. And so a bunch of people got together from the intensive care world to think about how could we be better prepared for future pandemics. In Australia and New Zealand, we did some observational work, which was quite valuable from a public health perspective, but we had no chance of putting together a clinical trial in the time span that was available. A wave would hit, it would last about 8 weeks, and you just can't launch trials, at least at that time, over that sort of time frame. So there was a meeting in 2010 in Toronto where Derek Angus, who was also one of the, together with you, me and Roger, probably the midwives of this thing. And your dad spoke at it, Scott. Yep. Don Berry talked about adaptive platform trial methods, and it made a lot of sense. Although I've got to say, I had to listen to talks from Don, from you, from Roger, at least 6 times before I finally thought, now I understand this thing called an adaptive platform trial. And then the 2012 meeting that you referred to was in Pittsburgh, and Roger Lewis was there. That was really a series of meetings about 9 months apart, where we decided that adaptive platform trials were the only thing that made sense for future pandemics, because they create warm infrastructure that can pivot and adapt rapidly to whatever is needed for a disease that can't be predicted in advance.
That I think comes to fruition. So there's lots of researchers meeting. ISARIC, John Marshall was at a number of these meetings, who ends up being a very important player in the REMAP-CAP story. And I think I entered this on July 2nd, 2012. There's an ISARIC meeting in Annecy, France. I believe you were there. Yeah. So I believe it's probably the first time we met in that. And I presented on adaptive trials. And it was the first sort of, what could this look like in a pandemic? There was a 2-day working group from that. And I think from that largely grew the Prepare network.
Correct. So Herman Goossens was very inspirational and influential infectious diseases physician based in Belgium. He understood the damage that pandemics could do to the world if one turned up, and the critical need of being able to generate evidence rapidly about optimal treatment in a situation where the clinical trial design and infrastructure needs to be constructed in the presence of enormous uncertainty. And so Herman proposed to the European Union that there would be a funding call for a consortium around pandemic preparedness. And it was a fantastic program of work. There was lots of laboratory science. There was stuff about diagnostics. There was stuff about consumer and community engagement, about how you prepare the community for a future pandemic in terms of the research that needs to be conducted at the time. And one of the work packages, work package 5, as I recall, was an adaptive platform trial for any future pandemic.
Yep. And that's sort of where I sort of really remember starting on this, and it was called Prepare. And we were talking about, at the time, I think we were talking about a platform for antibiotics. It was relatively generic treatment, but we hadn't jumped into the multifactorial, the huge aspect, which is really interesting part of the pandemic, was the multifactorial story of that. But we'll get to that. But
I think it was multifactorial from the get-go, but part of the discussion and the concept at the time was that the only way to be ready for a pandemic was to have sites that were already recruiting to other questions that are relevant to improving patient outcomes. And so part of the concept was to construct this platform that would do good things during the inter-pandemic period. And patients with pandemic influenza, as it turned out, pandemic COVID, all have essentially a diagnosis of severe acute respiratory illness or community-acquired pneumonia. And so the plan was to construct a platform that would recruit patients with community-acquired pneumonia, ask questions that were relevant to improving patient outcomes, because CAP is a major driver of bad outcomes, and be able to pivot when a pandemic turned up. So having succeeded in getting that grant call included within what was then the FP7 scheme, subsequently has become the Horizon scheme, Herman put together a really impressive consortium. Derek, myself, you all contributed to the design of what was included within Work Package 5. Was I don't know, it was maybe a page and a half in this massive grant application. And after the wheels turned inside the European Union, I don't know, can't even remember exactly what year is it. Might have been 2015 or 2016 now. That grant is successful, and we're away.
Yeah, and interestingly, as part of this story, the federation of this trial grows into something that has multiple sponsors globally and a single platform that has the federated, and we talk a little bit about that. But I found an email in December of 2013 where you send out that you now have funding from the NHMRC to extend this to Australia and what this would look like. And this starts a little bit the federation of what becomes REMAP-CAP.
Yeah, so that money was largely used to pay for the preliminary work that was necessary to write a grant application to the NHMRC for what was called various things back then. It was, once upon a time, it was GAC-SARI, then it was ADS-CAP, and then it was optimized CAP. But that NHMRC grant application was successful. And the preceding FP7 grant, I think, made a massive difference to the likelihood of success of the Australian grant, because it had already been through peer review in another location, even though it was a relatively small part of this big, massive pandemic preparedness consortia. But that gave it credibility, and I think that likely helped get it over the line. So that had us funded in 2 countries, well, in 2 regions. And next to come on board was John Marshall, who somewhere through that time period was successful at getting it funded through the CIHR in Canada. And really with Derek's intercession, we settled on the name of REMAP-CAP. Derek had a viewpoint article in JAMA through that era, where he had proposed the term REMAP to describe, the generic description of the beast, a randomized, embedded, multifactorial, adaptive platform trial. And of course, it was also remapping the way that clinical trial evidence should be generated. Derek's he's good. Derek's not short of marketing ability, and it matches his substance.
Yeah, and a fabulous name. So a little bit, you touched on this a little bit. Let's talk about the sort of scientific structure of this thing that was created, which started enrolling patients, I believe, in 2015. The first patient was enrolled in this.
Okay.
So it was 15 or 16. It was relatively early. We didn't have a super mature protocol, and we'll get into the development of what I think is a Tolkien-esque document in and of itself. But the prepare solution, you talked about this, was to start a standing master protocol where in the backdrop to this, and we called it a sleeping strata, we would talk about a potential pandemic. So if there was a swine flu, if there was pandemic X, we could immediately pivot to that. But meanwhile, there's a trial going on. And I believe the first therapies being used were 5 different antibiotics as an antibiotic strategy. So a patient could be randomized to that. A question of extending macrolide to 4 days or 10 days. So that was a second question that a patient could be randomized at in a factorial way, as long as the antibiotic had macrolide. And then was this strange beast, hydrocortisone, which I'm so fascinated by corticosteroids and do they work, do they not work question. But the question was, should you give patients steroids? Severe patients in these. Originally, I believe this was somewhat severe patients. This was ICU-based severe patients. And these were the 3 questions that were enrolling at the launch of this PREPARE trial that migrated in name to REMAP-CAP in a factorial experiment.
There was an initial protocol, which, to the best of my recollection, did get us recruiting in a small number of locations. That didn't include Australia at that stage. But I think it was apparent that the protocol that had been written initially was a standalone master protocol containing everything. And if one looked as to how this is going to evolve, adapt, new questions coming in, there was a feeling that this sort of single protocol document wasn't going to be effective over time. And that led us to the development of the modular protocol, which we've used, I think, quite successfully ever since. And the principle here is to have a core or master protocol that contains the eligibility criteria at platform level and the primary endpoint that's going to be used at platform level across all of the domains. Little bit about the disease of interest in terms of background, quite a bit about the statistical methods that are going to be used in the platform, although there's a separate statistical analysis appendix, but nothing about the interventions that are going to be evaluated within the platform. So we had to invent a word. We invented the word domain to describe sets of mutually exclusive interventions that would be represent the comparisons that existed around specific modes of therapy. And the protocol has this structure of a master protocol onto which are bolted multiple domain-specific appendices, and they contain the information about, the background information about why that's a relevant question and the appropriateness of the interventions and what's known, additional domain-specific eligibility criteria, where appropriate domain-specific secondary endpoints, and then my favorite section of every REMAP-CAP protocol, the statistical approach to this particular domain, which is like selecting from a menu that is set out in the master protocol, in the core protocol, about what statistical triggers, what combination of states and strata apply to this domain. That modular protocol structure, I think, has been a critically important part of the success of REMAP-CAP, and it was a substantial advance, and it proved its worth in the pandemic, where with this modular structure, we could write a new domain-specific appendix, do the associated data management changes, and have a new domain running in 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah. So we'll get to the pandemic, but I agree with you that the previous document wasn't ready for that. And I remember we had this sequence. There were a number of players involved. Colin MacArthur was involved. Alistair was involved. But it was a sequence of about a 3 weeks to a month where you, Derek, and I were, it was morning in the US. It was your evening. Derek and I would have coffee and you would have a glass of wine next to you and we'd be working on it. Then all of a sudden you'd wake up the next morning and it would be night and Derek has a nice big glass of wine and you've got your coffee. And it was morning and night writing this. And I refer to it almost as Tolkien-esque because Tolkien, when he wrote The Lord of the Rings and all this, he invented languages for the Elvish, he invented songs, and we had to invent all this terminology. What works for this description of a common set of interventions being compared? And you can't reuse a word that means something else in clinical trials, because then everybody confuses what you're doing. And we spent a huge amount of this inventing terminology that allowed this modular thing that you had to build this entire protocol infrastructure so that you could plug in a DSA and remove it, and the protocol doesn't change at all. I mean, it's built that you plug it and pull it out, and it functions. And as you say, incredibly quickly, we're addressing that question. It's part of the database. And so the master protocol itself is this amazing thing that has come out of REMAP-CAP that, by the way, many people have used, copied, which is fantastic, modeled after. It in of itself is an incredible sort of scientific achievement.
And I've spent a lot of time in the last couple of years talking to clinicians or even clinical trialists who've got experience with conventional clinical trial designs about adaptive platform trials. And it's the concept of the domain, which is one of the most difficult concepts to try and articulate and explain in a way that people get it. But I've got a new technique which is working really well, which is that I tell them, if the goal of the platform trial is to try and design the best possible Big Mac, then what you have is the components of the Big Mac as domains. So there's a pickle domain, yes or no for pickles. There's a beef patty domain. Is it flame grilled or fried? And people suddenly get the idea of what a domain is. But we had to go to a Big Mac to make progress.
And we then had to name the Big Mac is when you get all of the pieces of the domain that work, what do we call that? And we call that a regimen. So each piece together, the Big Mac itself is another regimen. We have patient subgroups where there may be differential effect. And so we named this and named all these pieces to it. So we went through this amazing thing. We set up the statistics. We talked about it. We set up response adaptive randomization can be done within the trial. We set up the entire thing as Bayesian. And interestingly, a foreshadowing of medical papers that come out of this have 0 p-values. All Bayesian triggers in all of this. So this is kind of all set up. And as you've said, when we had meetings, maybe 2017, everybody would come together. We've got this new protocol in this. Genevieve O'Neill, who's not working on REMAP-CAP anymore, she was on every one of these calls, I think, in making this go forward from Australia. But that we had more investigators than patients at the time. We're enrolling CAP. And
there was celebrations, there were fireworks, there was champagne popping when we finally had more patients enrolled than we had investigators.
Yeah. And by the way, we still, after the pandemic's over, we're back to this question of CAP. These patients are absolutely informing conclusions, and we've got exciting conclusions within CAP. But meanwhile, this Wuhan disease comes up, and it was interesting looking back at the genesis of this from early 2020 in January. There's this weird thing going on until March when it became part of REMAP-CAP.
So one of my favorite emails from REMAP, Scott, is the one I sent to Cameron Green, who is the extraordinary, amazing project manager that carried REMAP-CAP through the pandemic. Cameron sends me news links to this new disease in Wuhan, and he copies it to Colin MacArthur. And Cameron says, "Do you think we need to be worried about what's happening in Wuhan?" My response to Cam is, Cam, in the last couple of years, there have been these sort of little mini outbreaks. They cause a little bit of excitement and then they disappear reasonably quickly. That's what I expect will happen to this one. And besides, no pandemic in 2020, please. We're close, but we're not ready.
Yes, yes. Amazingly, we've said many times, we would have been so much better off if it was COVID 20 or
Yep.
1 year later. Now, we were never going to be ready for what it was, and it was going to be around the clock, but it was, and then it hit. And one of my other favorite emails was right about that time, we were now starting to get ready to run this trial. We had enrolled a set of patients. We were talking about doing analyses. And I think we had done several analyses up until this point. So I brought on two statisticians to help me, Lindsay Berry and Liz Lorenzi. And they have this email of saying, yeah, we've got this little thing in Wuhan, but, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. And they look back at this, and now they've been heroic in the analyses that have happened within REMAP-CAP as well. And this has now become an amazing story of their involvement as well. Okay.
I don't know how much you want to talk about the pandemic, but I think it's worth just at least one anecdote, Scott, that the speed with which the platform was able to do things was extraordinary. We talked about being able to launch a new domain in 3 or 4 weeks, although there were times during the pandemic when even that felt too slow. But historically, being able to launch a new trial for a condition that's never existed, interventions, a new set of interventions in 3 or 4 weeks was unprecedented. But we had this result in November of 2020.
Let's hang on. Let's sort of set this up a little bit. I do want to shift completely to the pandemic now. So let's talk about the pandemic. Let's talk about the start of it. And I've got an email from you. You're the chair of the ITSC, where you met with groups monitoring the pandemic. There are patients starting to trickle in at sites where REMAP-CAP is a trial there. And I've got it on March 2nd, 2020, that you declare we are open for the pandemic. At this time.
We had a sleeping strata that was in the first version of the modular protocol. And the question to the ITSC was, should we activate this sleeping strata? And there was a unanimity within the ITSC that was exactly what we needed to do.
So now this trial that had been built, as you described, all the way back in 2009, I'm sure pandemic preparedness has gone back further than that, but this whole idea of a platform trial being generated from that, getting funded by the EU, moving on to the different Australia thing, this idea, all of a sudden, March 2nd, 2020, the trial is now enrolling in the pandemic. So we've avoided this whole issue of, okay, now we have to design a trial for this question. We're already enrolling. And by the way, we have patients coming into this. And so the things that were already in the trial, some of these shift over into COVID. All three of them shift over. I think antibiotics became a not very interesting question within them, but macrolides became very interesting. Steroids became very interesting. Now, this is the part that you sort of touched on, is now the ability within the modular approach to start to add questions to it. So now we're open for business. We already have therapies we're interested in. We're shifted. Now, what does this process look like?
So the ITSC establishes processes to consider what interventions should we evaluate in this new disease. We're learning about this new disease in a very ad hoc way. There's my recollection quite a bit in the general media about all of these patients ending up in ICUs on ventilators, lots of arterial and venous thromboembolic complications. There's actually relatively little published, even in terms of case reports and cohort studies. And so we have to start making decisions about what's going to be evaluated. We have an existing corticosteroid domain, which includes hydrocortisone. We make some modifications to that domain, including a different dose of hydrocortisone. And we actually managed to recruit the first COVID patient into a COVID-specific domain for corticosteroids, I think on March the 6th, which is before the WHO officially declared a pandemic. So that I think reflects the flexibility that the adaptive platform trial provided in this scenario. But we think about what else should be evaluated. And relatively quickly, we put together domains to evaluate drugs which are thought to have antiviral activity against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. There's a domain proposed that comprises different immune modulators, interleukin-6 receptor antagonists like tocilizumab, anakinra, interferon. There's also a question of whether or not patients should be routinely therapeutically anticoagulated with heparin. And that had entered practice, just seen as being appropriate to prevent arterial and venous thromboembolism, given the high incidence that was being observed. Sorry, excuse me. There's also
so let's set time to this. I believe so. March 2nd, REMAP-CAP says we're now enrolling patients COVID, suspected or proven COVID. March 6th, 4 days later, you're randomizing to something that was already there, the steroids. Added the immune modulation domain before the end of March. The convalescent plasma domain, I think, was added in April. Anticoagulation, as you described, is early May within that. So I believe this idea that you said every couple of weeks we're adding them, and then to some extent that felt slow, but we were doing this and adding those before. Just as May starts, we've added all these particular questions in a multifactorial thing. So some patients are being randomized to 4 and 5 questions at this point, which is just amazing.
I think at the height of the pandemic, the largest number interventions that were assigned to a patient in REMAP-CAP was 7. So that's multifactorial.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so now we're getting set up, and meanwhile, as you described, it would have been nice had this been another year. We're getting the operational part of this. We have multiple databases that are contributing to this. We want to be doing interim analyses very frequently in this trial. So it is a great deal of work by a huge number of people to get this ready to start doing analyses. And then mid-June happens.
Many people literally working 12, 14, 16-hour days, 7 days a week across many countries. Cameron Green, Colin, the Lisa Higgins, who was putting the data together at Monash at that stage, and the teams at Berry.
And, yep. Yep. The UK enrolling patients, Tony Gordon, Lenny Deirdre,
Yes.
getting all of this, amazing. So mid-June happens where we've done interim analyses, but nothing is triggered at this point. We've got triggers set up. Mid-June, the recovery trial, which, by the way, in and of itself is an amazing story of the recovery trial. REMAP-CAP's largely enrolling severe. Meanwhile, during, I think, July, we opened what's called a moderate state, a step different. So we're adding to the patient population in a modular way as well, but we're enrolling only severe at this point, defined as being on intensive care-based organ support. And we went through a whole bunch of things at this point is what is the definition of an ICU? Because people are using non-ICU things, and we had to lose the notion of whether you're located in an ICU or do you have ICU level care. So there were things we had to redefine because of the surges and all of that. But the recovery trial comes out with an announcement based largely on moderate patients that steroids are saving lives. And so REMAP-CAP is enrolling steroids, largely in a severe population. So REMAP-CAP does what at this point?
So I just want to comment about what an amazing trial recovery was. It was put together incredibly quickly. It was in some ways also an offshoot of the same group of people who'd been working on Prepare with Herman systems, and as you said, was predominantly focusing on ward patients, whereas REMAP-CAP was exclusively, at least initially, critically ill patients. So as soon as the recovery result comes out, the corticosteroid component of REMAP-CAP in patients with COVID ceases recruitment, and we start this huge amount of work to try and get our results analysed. You only really, one thing that all clinical trialists intuitively know very deep in their bones is there is nothing better when your trial has reached a certain conclusion, having another trial independently reach the same conclusion. Your anxiety levels drop enormously. So the WHO put together a process to try and do an individual patient meta-analysis across 5 or 6 trials that had been recruiting patients to steroids. And that all happened at light speed. The recovery result was released, changed global practice instantly in June. There was a manuscript, I think, I'm not sure precisely when it was, through July or August, but it was September when the WHO IPDMA was published, together with the primary manuscript of these other steroid trials, including REMAP-CAP. And the REMAP-CAP results were strongly supportive of the result that had come from recovery. With 500 or 600 patients, my recollection, we were sitting on a posterior probability of 93% superiority for hydrocortisone over no hydrocortisone. We wouldn't have been too far away from triggering with some additional recruitment, but it provided strong supportive evidence of the benefit of this cheap, widely available treatment for this dreadful disease.
It was another really neat thing of the Bayesian approach that at that time we stopped because care had changed. We couldn't give a control anymore. And so we got to read this out, and it was this 93% probability of superiority. It wasn't that we're non-significant. It was in the paper, we didn't need adjectives, moderate. It was, there's a 93% probability this is beneficial, which was such a cool part and a simple thing and such a straightforward scientific thing about a clinical trial that was a positive of the Bayesian thing.
Scott, we
Now,
need two.
yeah.
We need two T-shirts. One is "This is a p-value free zone," and the other is "We estimate treatment. We estimate treatment effect."
Yes. Oh, I thought you were going to go to the T-shirt that you wore much of 2020. That I will always remember. It had a picture. It was emoticon based. It had a picture of a magnet and then a pile of shit next to it, which was quite apropos for what was going on. Yes. Okay. So at that time, then REMAP-CAP adds the moderate state. It's now triggering a number of conclusions, and we'll get to some really important ones of those. But it's also cooperating with other platform trials in a multi-platform randomized trial. So it's working with Operation Warp Speed. And the trials, it's working with a Canadian one where we all pool our data together to have a single conclusion and a result, and we create a new thing for a trial. And then we open up a new domain. Simvastatin is open. Antiplatelet domain is opened. And then we start coming in with really interesting conclusions at the end of 2020 into early 2021.
Yeah. So one of those triggered on Christmas Eve, Scott. And many of us worked all the way through Christmas Day and doing the things that were necessary. That was one of the anticoagulation results, but I can't remember which one it was that triggered on December 24th.
The first one was the likely harm of severe.
Yeah.
Yep.
But before that, we'd had again a flurry of activity, because in about mid-November we'd triggered for the superiority of tocilizumab, an interleukin-6 receptor antagonist, compared to control. And I think the timeline is something like as follows. A week after, or it might have been 10 days after the statistical trigger, the then British Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, announces this result in a press release, or in a press conference. The following day, the treatment becomes standard care throughout the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. It's mid-November. Well, no, sorry, it's late November. We got that. I don't know what date we got that manuscript to the New England Journal of Medicine. I don't know if it was in December or January, but it was published in early February. We're talking about 8 or 9 weeks from statistical trigger to manuscript that's been through peer review, it's had revisions done, and it's published. It is light speed in the world of clinical trials.
Yeah, and likely saved tens of thousands of lives. Incredible therapy in it. It's amazing now the spread. Touching on this, so tocilizumab comes out within that. The anticoagulation being harmful and severe, beneficial and moderate comes out. Common therapies given, very impactful within this. What's interesting, something you said, and I remember not a panic, but we triggered the tocilizumab result of superiority, and we had a surge in the UK of patients. And so we had a good solid result, but there were like half the patients weren't even to 28 days yet. And so we triggered this, and the whole thing, what's going to happen when all of these came in? And of course, it came in almost the same. Incredibly beneficial as one of this, what's going to happen. You touched on this. I think every result that REMAP-CAP came up with its adaptive design, its Bayesian, its RAR, its multifactorial, was backed up by a result in a different trial. Typically after that, I think all of these results bore out with it, whether it was antivirals being harmful for severe patients, hydroxychloroquine within this, the benefit of steroids within it, the benefits of the IL-6 receptor antagonist, the anticoagulation result was backed up, the ACEs and ARBs, largely all of these things, vitamin C largely doesn't seem to be a benefit. I mean, it was amazing how it kind of got it right. You know, I don't mean to say in a doubting way, but oh my God, it kind of got everything right.
Well, in 2.5 to 3 years, the platform evaluated, fully tested, 17 repurposed medicines for a disease that had never existed before. There are a couple of results. I don't think the anticoagulation in critically ill patients was reproduced by another trial. I don't think there were other trials, or if they were, they were had insufficient sample size to address the question.
But it was the multi-platform. It was the Canadian attack trial, and combining.
Absolutely. The contributions from Active 4 and attack. Sorry, but Recovery reported their antiplatelet question. My recollection is before we reported ours, and they stopped having recruited about 15,000 patients, which is a extraordinary sample size, and their results were no difference in outcome with 28-day mortality as the primary endpoint. And we had this interesting result in REMAP-CAP, which is a rabbit hole that we shouldn't go down, of possibly there being non-proportional treatment effect across the ordinal scale that we were using. But my recollection is that there was something like a 93 or 95% probability of superiority for aspirin with 90-day mortality as the endpoint. And if we looked at the recovery survival curves, the Kaplan-Meier curves, we're really only starting to separate around day 30. So it's interesting how choice of endpoints and the meaningfulness of endpoints can impact on the appropriate or the generation of evidence to be applied to improve patient care.
Yeah. Another sort of amazing thing in the trial, and with these 17 results in COVID that you talked about, is most of them had the same design, that we're going to enroll till there's a 99% probability of superiority or a 95% probability that the effect was moderate at best, futility, that it didn't achieve above a certain threshold. But many times we don't have a maximum sample size. We just go till one of those results are hit. And we had sample sizes of these largely with these 17 different things, different designs. We had sample sizes for the arms from about 100 and a good number of them at 100, 200, 300, all the way up to over 1,000. And the time at which it triggered and said, here's the answer, varied from 100 patients to 1,000 patients, all spread out, and it just, depending on the effect of when it happened, this incredible demonstration of the power of adaptive learning and adaptive sample size when time was so incredibly critical.
Yep. The number of patients dying from COVID in any 1 week meant that a week's difference in when a result became available was important to public health. One of the things which I love about the Bayesian approach is just this opportunity to set a statistical trigger of the amount of confidence, the amount of credibility that is necessary to conclude a question, and then keep recruiting, analyze frequently, so that as soon as there's sufficient credibility to the result, the experiment can be concluded. And I think about all of the things I learned when I was doing biostats and epi as a master's student, and thought all of these things about not answering the question until you've recruited your proposed sample size based off a power calculation. And I thought, oh, these are really, really important features of design. I now understand, I still understand why they're important, but I do think there's a better way.
Fantastic.
Especially when it's appreciated that so frequently the estimates about the size of treatment effect that are necessary run clinical trials using that approach, guesses that are capable of being not just wrong in a quantifiable way, but wrong in the direction of the treatment effect as well. And one of the really good things that came out of REMAP-CAP was we tested a variety of treatments because they were being used off-label where the treatment turned out to be harmful. And the way the REMAP-CAP statistical triggers are set up, particularly with futility, if there's an intervention that's very harmful, it triggers very quickly for harm. It's not necessary to statistically prove if that's a valid concept that something is harmful. You just need to know it's not effective. But some of the biggest public health impact in REMAP-CAP came from early identification of harmful interventions that were in standard care at the time.
Yeah. Incredible. So the story continues. The REMAP-CAP story continues. It is still enrolling patients. I think I looked today, there are 240 sites enrolling. It's enrolling community-acquired pneumonia. It's evolving. It is ready for a pandemic, the virus or whatever happens to be next. We are ready. Within this, we also are getting results in community-acquired pneumonia, influenza. We're hoping to have on this show to talk about some of the results that are coming out. I think June 10th in Belfast, there are results coming out. So it is still doing incredible things.
It just rolls on.
Yeah. So incredible. I appreciate you helping me start to get our hands around this beast. The beginning of this, there's a lot to talk about in this, and I think we're going to come back with lessons learned, different results, specific statistical things, response adaptive randomization results. So lots more to talk about REMAP-CAP. Steve, thank you very much for joining me on the origins of REMAP-CAP.
Thank you, Scott. It's been great to chat.
And everybody else, thank you all for listening. And until next time, we'll be here in the interim.